So our speaker this afternoon is Brett Thatcher. Brett Thatcher is a social worker and clinician at Gould Farm, where he has lived for 13 years. Arriving initially as a year-long volunteer after graduate studies in systemic theology, engaging with the farm's model of care led to a shifting of career ambitions, sending Brett back to school at Boston's College School of Social Work. He maintains a small private practice and is obsessed with his sassy, personality-filled cat named Claire. His interests leave him spending free time nerding out with psychoanalytic and queer theory, reading through stacks of contemporary fiction, preparing too much food for dinner with friends, riding his gravel bike, only recently avoiding bone-breaking crashes. I'm very glad to hear that. And trail running around the farm. So everyone, please help me welcoming our next speaker, Brett.
Hearing that out loud sounds like a terrible dating profile. I don't know what I was thinking. Especially with the picture that Stephanie put up here too. But really, thank you. This is really a privilege to be having these conversations today, and especially to follow Ross and Jeremy from this morning. I'd like to start with a couple epigraphs from the novel A Little Life. And there are handouts with my longer quotes. Raise your hand if you still need one. But it hadn't been easy. In truth, it had been at times aggressively difficult. In some ways remained so. When he had promised himself that he wouldn't try to repair Jude, he had forgotten that to solve someone is to want to repair them. To diagnose a problem and then not try to fix that problem seemed not only neglectful, but immoral. They are quiet for a long time. Do you remember the time you told me you were afraid that you were a series of nasty surprises for me? He asks him, and Jude nods slightly. You aren't, he tells him. You aren't, but being with you is like being in this fantastic landscape. You think it's one thing, a forest, and then suddenly it changes, and it's a meadow or a jungle or cliffs of ice. And they're beautiful, but they're strange as well. And you don't have a map, and you don't understand how you got from one terrain to the next so abruptly, and you don't know when the next transition will arrive. And you don't have any of the equipment you need. And so you keep walking through and trying to adjust as you go, but you don't really know what you're doing. And often you make mistakes, bad mistakes. That's sometimes what it feels like. These quotes from Hanya Yanagihara's 2015 novel, A Little Life, evoke something of the painful tensions, the ambiguous challenges, and the meaningful companionship that inhere in a clinical sensibility that I hope to demonstrate in this presentation. They also highlight that no matter how reparative our subsequent experience, no matter the processing accomplished, we do not move beyond our most painful experiences, but instead continue to live them out, though we can certainly hope in more vibrant and personally possessed ways. Too often, however, the external gaze, especially the clinical one in cases of psychosis, disregards the value of these personally meaningful achievements when it does not fit typical scripts of normative living. And in reference to Ross's talk this morning, I think one of the ideas I'm playing with is what would it look like and how can we drop the clinical gaze? With those ideas at the fore, my paper will proceed in two parts. First, using Gould Farm's treatment program as a case study, I will illustrate a way of working with psychosis that prioritizes the complexity and humanity of the individual enduring it. I argue throughout that the symptoms involved, rather than simply experiences to be excised, represent both meaning-making and self-making efforts. Gould Farm's approach, developed over the course of 11 decades, and with various stages of relationship to larger mental health systems, resists categorization under current treatment modalities. Resisting the pull toward the refrain heard in my time at the farm to simply respect the magic of Gould Farm, I intend to discuss aspects of the farm's treatment model in relation to literature on psychosis and clinical process to query why and how the model is effective, and hopefully open avenues for discussing how what we have learned can be more broadly applicable in a world criminally lacking in adequate care. In the second part of my presentation, I will take up and think with Avgi Saketopoulou's recent work in which she terms traumatophilia to highlight tensions that arise even in current best practices with psychosis, both in my experience at Gould Farm and in broader mental health care systems. I hope to offer starting points to begin collectively reimagining what our practices could look like, addressing problematic aspects of the ideals of recovery that I believe maintained a fantasized relationship with cure. As Dimon and Cushman have demonstrated, such ideals are always already embedded in value systems, which often take an unreflective positionality within neoliberal logics that are worth our time examining if part of our goal is to support individuals with psychosis live more expansive, self-determined, and fulfilling lives. Throughout, I will draw our attention to aspects of our contemporary world and social structures that psychotic experiences refuse to deny, but which we are desperately habituated to disavow. Founded in 1913, Gould Farm, as its mission states, is a therapeutic community that promotes recovery for people with mental health and related challenges through meaningful work, community living, and clinical care. The farm welcomes individuals with psychotic experiences in addition to other varied diagnoses who are integrated into a milieu that includes people with a wide range of life experiences and challenges. Significantly, most staff live on the 700-acre property and make up an intergenerational community, including staff and their families, year-long volunteers, and guests, the traditional name given to clients at Gould Farm. All participate in shared meals, activities driven by both guest and staff interest, and various celebrations of community and cultural traditions. Guests and staff choose to come to the farm for their individual relationship to its mission, whether it's for treatment, service, or employment, yet share a common responsibility as community members. As such, community members come to occupy multiple roles beyond those indicated by their title, a fruitful forum for relational exploration and growth. Though there are clear and important clinical boundaries maintained between staff and guests, this integration with others into a real community indexes an important, if potentially axiomatic, point. The experience of psychosis exists on a continuum with so-called normal circumstances, in that the symptom and the person are in many respects one and the same. As such, my perspective here differs from medical models that see psychosis as simply evidence of some underlying, though as yet unidentified pathology, or models that seek to place the psychotic propensities on a different developmental pathway than neurotic symptoms. Psychosis is deeply human and often painfully so. The structure of the community at Gould Farm lays the foundations for this conviction. It does not exist and is not designed simply for the sake of treatment. It is relied upon and built not just by those in treatment, but also by staff and their families who make it up and live their lives within it too, maintaining continuity of its values and ethos even as individuals move in and out over time. Moreover, individuals who experience psychosis participate in the same treatment structures as persons with other mental health diagnoses. There's no psychotic disorders track or treatment, and therefore all guests are invited to the same, if differently inflected, benefits of the program. Though this welcome is a foundation for belonging, it needs to be hard-won again and again for each individual and collectively, depending on the configuration of the community at different times, a process that often highlights the robust resistances and impact of stigma. Alongside and within this emphasis on community, Gould Farm's treatment modality centers participation in meaningful work. Guests spend the majority of their scheduled time on work teams, in the garden growing vegetables, in the bakery making bread and pastry, in the kitchen preparing community meals, on campus crew maintaining the grounds and trails, maintenance keeping up the aging infrastructure, at the farm tending to the dairy herd, or at the cafe interfacing with the local public. Punctuating this structure are meetings with a psychotherapist to use these experiences toward individualized ends, skills-based groups to make navigating challenges more attainable, and groups and activities that take advantage of shared interests in the beautiful land on which the farm is situated. Guests also meet regularly with consulting psychiatrists for medication management. Though the use of psychotropic medications is by no means simple or without ambivalent meaning, its use often enables individuals to participate in the opportunities at Gould Farm and provides a foundation to establish enough safety or stability to build a relationship with one's symptoms and support meaning-making and self-making efforts. With this overview of the farm in mind, I offer a metaphor. Consider a clay vessel, sturdy and watertight, thick and dense enough to insulate heat from inside or outside. And I'm being a little grand here, you can just picture your favorite mug. With much care put into its construction and upkeep, with deep sentimental and maybe monetary value. Through the apparent fault of no one, though you're compelled to search for chains of causation, the vessel smashes. Naturally, you seek to piece this valued item back together. You research and try various types of glue and adhesive. You put lots of time into arranging the pieces and being sure you know where each shard belongs. And perhaps you try a few times, needing to readjust your approach. But in the end, you're able to have your vessel reasonably reconstructed. It's likely not as watertight anymore. You don't trust it in the microwave. Perhaps it even fulfills a different purpose as an object of adoration on a shelf rather than as your daily workhorse and constant companion. This, I would offer, is the current compassionate picture of successful recovery from psychosis. Something catastrophic happens, there's no final single cause to point to, and multiple efforts are assembled to reassemble the cherished individual and place them back on their previous trajectory. Through these efforts, and in the best cases, a changed sense of the person emerges, perhaps with new limitations and sense of place or vocation in the world. This sense of recovery, promoted fiercely and importantly by the recovery movement, is described by Anthony as, quote, a deeply personal, unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, feelings, goals, skills, and/or roles, end quote. This is a worthy project, but one whose boundaries I propose could be widened. The most personal process is not separate from the social, and it is from the social that we draw the ingredients of our becoming. For some, perhaps, to return to our metaphor, once the clay vessel is broken, the task is less reassembly and more new assemblages. What if the vessel at the end of the process, or at various stages of the process of arranging pieces, looks unlike its original form? What if it no longer serves our expected purposes? What if it fails to meet our shared aesthetic standards, and the pieces instead display a matter of fit that challenges our notions of beauty or usefulness or worth? These are important questions as we explore what supports individuals' process at Gould Farm, and as I turn later in the paper to more critical questions of regulatory norms that shape our conceptions of desirable outcomes. The way we hold norms and our capacity as treaters is significant in whether we facilitate or forestall the possibility of a generative process. So Gould Farm's history carries a long tradition of welcome. Even the term we use for residents in treatment, guests, originates from the founding of the community when everyone living here was a guest of the Goulds. Admittedly, this was a time when roles were far more permeable, but a focus on hospitality remains in many forms today in an atmosphere into which all Gould farmers are socialized, some of us more easily than others. Visitors are announced and applauded for their presence, and new guests and staff are subjected to applause at their first appearance at each of our many, many weekly meetings and gatherings. Activities are reviewed for their capacity to be inclusive, efforts are extended to make every invitation to current happenings, and the community is frequently lauded for the inability to tell who is staff and who is a guest. An observation certainly laced at times with stigma, but that also notices the ways living here goes beyond giving or receiving mental health treatment. Welcome gives way to belonging in various ways. Despite the normalizing environment, symptoms are frequently displayed and become normative in the community. Folks engage their voices, appear to disappear into their own worlds, speak about experiences and relationships with the world and its dangers that we do not share, and present disparate ways of organizing themselves in community and relationships. And still they belong. They're invited to join a group for a mealtime conversation, they are acknowledged on the outskirts of events, and their contributions are appreciated, explicitly in team and community meetings. In various scenarios, particularly when new to the community, guests receive a constantly validating attitude. During the work program in particular, a place is found for each individual, varying greatly depending on interest, skill, physical ability, presence of mind, motivation, sometimes depending on the day. Much could be said about the work program's ability to offer opportunities to see oneself as capable and as valued, or with self-efficacy as we were speaking about earlier. Much feedback, both implicit and explicit, is offered throughout the course of the workday with an eye toward preparing individuals for the world that has a different lens on belonging and usefulness. This is an important distinction I'll return to later. The importance of seeing one's impact directly is significant. The food I cooked on the table, the vegetables I seeded and tended going to the kitchen, the cow I cared for providing milk for ice cream, the trails I enjoyed, and on and on. Lest I suggest this is all simple and easy and perfect, you know it's not. These processes are frequently a daily, sometimes minute-to-minute struggle for both staff and guests. But that we struggle in it together and sometimes struggle with each other is as much the point. I've written previously about this struggle within the framework of intersubjectivity as important efforts toward the goal of mutual recognition. And while that remains an important dimension, I would add too that difference uncontained by ideals of recognition, understanding, or dialectical resolution has an important place in the ongoing construction of subjectivities. That someone remains welcome and has a place, not dependent upon some shared understanding or compulsory accommodation, is a key element here. One illustration of this occurs at the farm's weekly community meeting, during which a large portion of our time is set aside for appreciations, verbal offerings of gratitude between community members in public view. During a typical week, these range from small kindnesses to work contributions, and unsurprisingly, this is a favorite event for some and reads as sentimental and false to others. I'm often struck during an individual's final community meeting preceding a transition out of the community where appreciations are focused on the departing community member. The authenticity of these is frequently refreshing in their honesty, sometimes presenting in a form, this is my favorite one, "You are a huge pain in the ass, but I like you anyway." Disclosures like this suggest you are valued not just in your favored aspects, but as you are seen in your wholeness, even the bad and ugly, potentially diffusing shame, I think Sachs would say. More often, it seems as if guests' narratives of how their time at the farm has helped is in spite of the program, the ways they refuse expectations, participate in milieu currents that look problematic from typical therapeutic perspectives, and carve out their own ways of belonging. I suspect the dedication to welcoming individuals as they are, perhaps more than any programmatic or therapeutic design, supports the becoming of our guests, particularly for those whose psychotic experiences have occasioned persistent rejection and iatrogenic attempts to cure them in the wider world. This welcoming environment is a significant challenge to the common presentation of individuals who feel automatic and chronic mistrust, vigilance, vulnerability, fear, and suspicion, common features of psychosis. This mistrust is often adaptive and so commands deeper consideration than simple attempts at remedy. Closeness and independence can both feel like the threat of death to psychotic parts of the self. There's absolutely no shortcut for working with these matters of trust. Time here is an indispensable element. The folly of a focus on evidence-based interventions and time-limited treatment here lays bare the truth of our patients' suspicions of systems at best lacking a regard for their interests, or at worst as bad actors manipulating their lives for others' gain. A recognition of the human mind's dissociative structure has become commonplace in psychological and neurological discourses, with routine reference to self states or parts of the self. Sadly, however, the literature on psychosis too frequently fails to extend the fruitful complexity of this multiplicity to its subjects, restricting itself to divisions between the psychotic parts and non-psychotic parts of the personality. Negotiating the construction of a trusting relationship is vastly improved when we mentalize ourselves and our clients with this complex interplay of parts. An advantage of Gould Farm's open setting and integration of guests and the treatment team into a singular community is that it elicits the many parts of individuals in their various roles or ways of participating. The normalizing environment invites relationship with the many aspects of an individual, including ones that infrequently enter into treatment relationships. A guest I work with in individual therapy may also be encountered at the ultimate Frisbee game I host, shared meals, at a movie night or group hike or philosophy club, on call in a crisis situation, casually on a walk while I tend my yard down the road, and in discussion with work leaders or residential staff who come to know them in further varied contexts. Opening possibilities for relationship and alliance with all the aspects of a person becomes the aim, rather than just allying with particular or non-psychotic parts. To this point, John Kafka notes that despite their disparate perspectives, writings from the staff of Chestnut Lodge demonstrate agreement on this point. Quote, "All Chestnut Lodge authors recognized, on the one hand, the importance of using the healthy part of the individual patient, and on the other hand, the importance of following the patient into his or her psychotic world, end quote. The experience of being recognized in this more complete way offers an opportunity for the guest to identify with a loosely assembled or integrated enough whole in the minds of the treatment team. Nafo and Seltzer describe this integrative aim when they write, consistent with the patient's belief that they have lost themselves, some mental health professionals have developed a theory of ego deficiency in psychosis, which posits a dissolution of the ego and personality. We believe that any such theory of internal disintegration or lack, unfortunately and of necessity, commits the therapist to a process of reconstruction or structure building, sets a limit on treatment goals, and fails to consider patients as equal partners in their recovery. We believe that the patient has not lost themselves, but rather disconnected from a part of themselves, even reinventing themselves to do so. By collaboratively understanding their unconscious motives and the meaning of their symptoms, the therapist creates a bridge to the part of the self that has been ousted from their consciousness. This invitation to lost parts moves in an ever unresolved tension between trust and suspicion, well conceptualized by Bromberg as self-states trying to find relational existence, facilitated by contexts that are safe but not too safe. Meaningful relationship always involves real risk, but the reasonable expectation that one's psychic reality will not be respected, but instead dismissed, certainly preempts relationship from the start. So the discourse around psychotic symptoms, if not theoretically, then clinically and practically, requires us to affirm that symptoms are meaningful constructions that deserve our attention, curiosity, and respect. Not infrequently, they represent idiomatic ways of understanding and navigating a sense of self and the world. In delineating how to work with symptoms, Nafo and Seltzer highlight the adaptive nature of symptoms, their capacity to attenuate affect, demonstrate meaning-making systems structured with intelligence and logic in the face of potentially annihilating circumstances, and symptoms' communicative mechanisms. The esteemed Dr. Reidenauer points to the way delusions provide structure to an individual's confusing variable self-experience. The challenge for the clinician, whose experience so clearly and dramatically differs from the client, is obvious. Davoine and Gaudelier evoke this when they write that the huge energy of the excess of the unfiltered unconscious produces intense physical and psychical impressions, which express themselves sometimes through voices, images, vision, signs that are impossible to validate except in our uncanny transference. Bolus notes that the task is to ask after symptoms without judging them, and without ignoring the mental reality that the voices or other symptoms are the self in disguise. So what is the clinical disposition that allows us to suspend our normal ways of thinking, evaluating, and judging, of knowing what's real, what's best? I turn now to thinking about the role of companioning, when, as Scarfoni suggests, the task is to forego our pride in understanding, enabling our patients to form their own meanings and become critical self-authors of their own narratives. While the fields of mental health continue to bandy phrases like self-determination, person-focused, strengths-based, meet them where they are, a reflexive stance of knowing better, a sense of automatic omnipotence, enters our work with psychosis. And of course, we have the comfort and confidence of speaking from a place of consensual, obvious reality, and we have been tasked with supporting our clients in adapting to that reality. Whether considering our approach to those who make it into our care or larger social problems met by those psychosis, it's important to ask the question, what sort of approach would leave someone wanting to engage in supportive treatment? Robert Grossmark's concept of the unobtrusive companioning register is helpful in conceptualizing a clinical frame addressing this query of the desirability of treatment. In brief, this describes a stance with clients that involves going further into our patients' worlds of suffering and private madness rather than working to move them out of these states. The therapist need not obstruct the unfolding and emergence of the patient's idiosyncratic internal world in the treatment, yet remains emotionally engaged and intimately connected to the patient. Being the therapist the patient needs you to be, and being prepared to live in a world of illusion with the patient. So even with psychotic experience, this means maintaining a respect for the individual's psychic reality and particular way they narrate their experience, enabling their reality to impinge on our own. Bertram Caron pointed out that the avoidance of work with psychosis is often defensive against what psychosis reveals about humanity in general. And I would say this avoidance extends to those of us who work with psychosis when we as treaters use our knowledge of consensual reality to defend against the places that experience invites us. Theorizing difference here reveals countertransference anxieties and perhaps a fantasy in integration and knowledge as cure, as McLuhan would note. Elsewhere, she describes case material as pointing to painful demands on the therapist. Quote, "My patient and others like her require us to access the most profound experience of our own aloneness, and that this willingness and capacity to be provoked and live again in primitive mix-up with our patients offers a form of hope and love and vision of the other that uniquely puts the therapist in touch with both the suffering and the potential of the patient." End quote. Many writers advocate a respect for the unformulated, the negative, the unsymbolized, the enigmatic, and I would extend this to accompany our clients in the differently narrated and understood, the delusional and the hallucinatory, even if the end goal is not shared symbolization. The community context of Gould Farm enables generative enactment of these elements. Grossmark suggests that we, quote, "allow these enactments to flow and manifest in the area of the unknowable and non-represented, and to avoid foreclosing the process of deepening enactments, gesturing toward the capacity of symptoms and idiomatic understandings to generate personally meaningful agentic experiences." This is not simply about uncovering the history or the unconscious meaning of symptoms, but to regard them as not having a determinate meaning and offering a context in which the person can utilize them in forming and reforming self-narratives of oneself in the world. Scarfoni points out that, empirically speaking, this open stance toward the client's self-theorizations changes the way the therapist listens, and consequently the atmosphere which enables enlivened engagement from the client. This frequently means being rendered useless in the clinical encounter. Sometimes this is offered overtly by the guest: "I don't want to meet, I don't need therapy," maybe they just don't show up. More often, however, this helplessness is demanded with less clarity. Required by the guest's choices to sit in a bystander role, we are asked to listen and validate repeated narratives of deep suffering, while any suggestion or effort to explore, manage, or tolerate is met with frank refusal. And yet, there's something in the surrendering to these countertransferential states that opens possibilities for relationship, an invitation to enter into the uncanny, or symbiosis, or even vertigo. To enable the chance for participation in clients' process, enduring the rejection of our normal capacities and confidences becomes important. Undoubtedly, this leaves the therapist asking, "What am I doing here?" and non-clinical program staff questioning an individual's fit in the program. They're not using the program, this isn't helping, what are they still doing here? Manifesting tensions between clinical and non-clinical staff and how they see the person and how they see the person using the program or not, often asking these questions in different circumstances. And yet, these seemingly static states demonstrate a willingness to accompany our clients on their own terms, not on those set by our profession, by our organizations, by our need to feel like adequate caregivers. This proves true when we become our clients' bad objects as well, a state of affairs we're all familiar with, but our position of knowing in relation to the irrationality of psychosis too easily allows us to avoid doing our own work. Allowing clients the time to talk and be heard, validating what often feels invalid, unreal, and allowing ourselves to be impacted by them may generate enough energy for what Fonagy and Allison identify as the epistemic tipping point, when, quote, "the patient becomes aware of the proximity or contiguity or similarity of shape between their experience of themselves and the way their therapist sees them," end quote. That the client can feel and see our efforts, and I think this is especially true when resonance or coherence escapes us, to develop a sense of them in our mind enables the safe enough. It is this space for epistemic trust that allows the individual to again become interested in other subjective realities and begin to trust the social world. What the individual does with this information is not determinate and cannot be dictated by our normative prescriptions, no matter how we try. Returning to the metaphor of the clay pot, These experiences in context of welcome and companioning at Gould Farm offer a place and time in which guests have the opportunity to bring the broken pieces of themselves together in ways that may or may not look familiar to us. Both the centering and decentering of symptomatic experience in relating to people on their own terms and in communal belonging, respectively, potentiate the process of becoming and self-making. One final aspect that draws together these dimensions: it's hard to know individuals so thoroughly and consequently have an idea of what we do not know, of what remains opaque and inaccessible, but to eat together, to play together, to share our lives, and to not care deeply about them. Lang, for example, tells us that the main agent in uniting the patient and allowing the pieces to come together and cohere is the physician's love, a love that recognizes the patient's total being and accepts it with no strings attached. Bromberg adds another aspect here that resonates with the experience of being in community at Gould Farm. Hope comes not from just being accepted as you are, but from being needed as you are. From the recognition that in some genuine way, being with you as you are brings your therapist pleasure despite your problems. As I conclude this gloss on Gould Farm's model, it may seem as if I'm not offering anything revolutionary or distinctly new to exploring the treatment of psychosis, and I suppose I'm not. I hope it's clear that I'm pointing to an aspirational clinical sensibility that approaches psychotic experience in a very commonplace way. First and foremost, by being with another person, offering a space for them to be who they are in all their complexity, not assuming that I enter into the relationship with some possession of truth or knowledge of what is best for them. This is not to say there's not a place for our expertise, for the employment of specific techniques, or management of particular countertransferences with psychosis, but that we begin by venturing to understand the individual's psychic reality on its own terms and validate its place with respect to that person's desires and history, however strange or unfamiliar their idiomatic narration. Objective reality cedes to community norms of belonging, companionship, and welcome as the normative frame for treatment and shared living. The benefits and possibilities of this approach, however, meet their limit when considered in relation to the necessary transition out of the community and into a world that is decidedly unwelcoming and non-companioning. That our interventions, our invitations to the whole of persons, must be tempered for the work of readiness for adaptation to a world as it is, the place of original harm and ongoing rejection, highlights a deep injustice that compels us to think beyond the belonging we facilitate. To that end, I turn now to a discussion intended to provoke inquiry into our habituated notions of recovery and their relationship to our broken world. So for the second part of my paper, I offer an experiment. And that's to think psychosis with Avgi Saketopoulou's work in which she terms traumatophilia. This recent work is a bold intervention into current psychoanalytic, therapeutic, cultural, and political discourses on trauma. As my language of thinking with would suggest, I'm not encouraging us to apply this reconceptualization of thinking about trauma uncritically to thinking and treating psychosis. However, significant critical work has demonstrated a great deal of overlap, both conceptually and phenomenologically, between trauma and psychosis. I'm thinking, again, of Davoine and Gaudelier's work here, supporting a careful consideration of the application of these ideas. Unfortunately, time and space do not enable a full examination of Saketopoulou's wide-ranging perspective, so the summary here will be necessarily limited to a sketch of elements I'll bring to bear on working with psychosis. Drawing on Laplanchian metapsychology and various critical discourses, Saketopoulou describes her approach as follows. I argue that a theorizing of traumatic inscription that assumes trauma to be unchanging and immobile is traumatophobic. Traumatophobia keeps trauma inert, and that poses a problem because trauma that is not inserted into circulation does not wither and disappear. It stalls and it controls us. Trauma, I argue, needs to circulate. It needs to be revisited. I describe this approach of maintaining a hospitable attitude to the revisitation of trauma as traumatophilic. Traumatophilia does not overlook or diminish the impact of trauma, but offers instead a way of working with the recognition that we cannot turn away from our traumata, that we are strangely drawn to them. To recognize that traumatic experience is not possible to eliminate takes mental fortitude, as the human impulse is to cling to the idea that trauma can be resolved. But sustaining such illusions is not humane. Much as we would want to think otherwise, the impact of traumatic experiences cannot be eliminated or repaired. At best, we live in their aftermath on different terms than when they were inflicted on us. Relinquishing the idea that trauma can be repaired opens paths to thinking about what subjects do with their trauma. Saketopoulou's injunction is not to offer a singular prescriptive clinical stance. Rather, it is to expand beyond a nearly reflexive set of clinical responses we are trained to produce when presented with a patient's trauma, such as containment, witnessing, processing, interpreting, symbolizing, holding, reflecting. Now, these all have their place and value, but a toolkit restricted to these is impoverished. She continues, what I'm trying to point out is that we sometimes move too quickly to settle psychic energies that handled differently could prove transformative, and to suggest also that traumatic phobic ideologies offer excellent alibis for the analyst to manage her own anxieties around a patient's traumatophilic leanings, by construing the patient's traumatophilic inclinations as a symptom of how powerfully the patient has been besieged by trauma. Moreover, Saketopoulou's traumatophilic stance privileges the opaque and enigmatic in us and recognizes the potential and experiences that press on the psychic sites of trauma, perhaps inducing experiences of overwhelm that may enable a reconceptualization of ourselves, generating aliveness and inspiration. These changes are not accretive and supportive of what we already think we know about ourselves, nor are they of the sort promoted by campaigns that seek to buttress our narcissism, for example, be your best self and so on. They refer rather to experiences that open us up, exposing us to the surprising and to the strange in ourselves. Repetition and experiences that move toward overstimulation, and Saketopoulou emphasizes the capacity of perverse erotic experience and artistic performance in this regard, can be seen as a path to the ego's unraveling. This unraveling, rather than being necessarily harmful, may in turn bring down previously established meanings in favor of new ones that might replace them. Insofar as social norms are the very ingredients that make up the construction of our egos, our foundational understandings of ourselves and ourselves in the world, such experiences of overwhelm and unraveling contain, quote, the radical potential for self and world making, end quote. Parallel with Saketopoulou's concern with false helps of returning to pre-traumatic states, I regularly find myself concerned with fantasies that treatment of psychosis, even if fully successful in eradicating psychotic symptoms, will return someone to the same prelapsarian state of being and life trajectory, as if the disruptive event of the psychosis has not occurred. This reality requires a more complex appreciation of experience endured, something I think was articulated well by Freud. Quote, his illness must no longer seem to him contemptible, but must become an enemy worthy of his mettle, a piece of his personality which has solid ground for its existence, and out of which things of value for his future have to be derived. While Freud here is not speaking about psychosis in particular, he gestures toward the importance of symptoms beyond their resolution, that they are meaningful and are the stuff out of which new selves are built. Given this conviction, and with a loosening of our omnipotence described previously, I wager that the clinical ethic Saketopoulou offers us in her traumatophilic perspective would serve us in accompanying folks with psychosis. Anticipating that there are nuances to be worked out, I propose that we extend Saketopoulou's description of a psychoanalytic ethic to the treatment of psychosis. Quote, ethics pertain to fostering non-dominating relationships with the results of our patients' own self-theorizings. That is, the ways in which patients dare experiment with themselves, without us trying to control the outcome, end quote. Though there are plenty of examples indicating that an appreciation of psychotic symptoms' meaningfulness is essential, the aim of this appreciation often strikes me as less than imaginative, seeking nothing more than normative ends of love and work and assimilative projects, as if in identifying their meaning, I can and should move beyond them, even as they have shaped and are shaping me. Thinking psychosis with traumatophilia may provide us something more, something more for our clients, and something more than the poverty of the normal. In this framework then, borrowing Saketopoulou's pivot, instead of a focus on resolution of symptoms and helping the individual fit into the neoliberal forms we are accustomed to, what if we were curious about what the person does with their symptoms? As described above, I see a context such as Gould Farm, where the individual is welcomed and accompanied as they are, as fertile soil for the use of psychotic experiences to inform a process of becoming, a process that would be further enabled by a clinical stance that remains open to non-normative ends and that trusts the ways our clients return to their symptoms. The possibilities I raise here are certainly not prescriptive of a technique that pushes our clients in particular directions, but rather that responds to and supports clients' own driven behaviors. In no way do I mean to diminish the deep and terrifying suffering that occasions much psychotic experience and its impact on an individual, family, and community's life. Indeed, serious and often imminent concerns of safety and integrity inhere in our clinical decisions and posture. These are, of course, important considerations, but a widening of our capacity to hold anxiety about the way our clients' preoccupations divert from our own would serve more capacious possibilities. For many clients, the possession of their symptoms or their symptoms' possession of them feels essential to them. They protect them from us when they know we seek to excise them. And of course, what would any part of us do if sought for elimination? It's not as if we check our sense of reality at the door, as if we could do that, but we do offer our sense of reality as marked, as mine, with a respect to what remains psychically essential for the other. There's a radical honesty important here, too. It's not that I don't express my concerns or my limits. This remains deeply important, but that I allow myself to be open to the other's alterity and be defamiliarized from myself and what I know. This means differently owning familiar anxieties here for the clinician. Anxieties about safety, about allowing a descent into madness, about our responsibility to various stakeholders, about acknowledging the damage done by systems we inhabit and participate in. A compulsory move toward regulation dominates in mental health treatment, and while this is often in response to an individual's distress, we also exert our influence to pull individuals back from experiences they are drawn to, but that we imagine touch too closely on the content of delusions, the preoccupation of voices, the possibility of overstimulation. That religious ritual seems too triggering, a meditation retreat would be too much, the erotic content of that would blow them out of the water, and so on. From a traumatophilic lens, perhaps leaning into these appetites like these may enable worthwhile experience, even if or because there is a quality of too much. Though there's certainly no guarantees here, perhaps the experience could be transformative. It may be that the drive to engage what we call symptoms, what seems outside the bounds of what we are able to understand or language in a way we can validate, contains a wisdom for this individual's process of self-making. Volkan and Volkan's idea of organismic panic, sort of a sustained emotional flooding that they write about as a important stage in restructuring psychotic personality organizations is similar to what I'm developing here, but they're talking about more normative ends with so-called mastery of emotional experience, which is always a phrase that makes me giggle. Accompanying this undertaking requires a great deal of responsibility to the other, staying with the process and not seeking to control it, not knowing what will come either in the client or in me. Though this is, of course, fraught for the clinician, the reality is that we do not know what will come of any of our interventions. We never control our client's process, no matter how tightly we hold to our theories, our expertise, our diagnoses. Provocatively, Saketopoulou reminds us of the stakes here. Too often, attention is paid to a patient going too far and becoming overwhelmed, when it might sometimes be better placed on the analyst's resistances to the patient's overwhelm. To the analyst, that is, interfering with the patient going far enough for the possibility of overwhelm to arise at all. Safety, in that sense, becomes dangerous, a danger the costs of which are incalculable. One can measure what went wrong, but one cannot measure what never became, what one never got to experience. I'm obviously not issuing considerations of safety, but rather highlighting places we do not afford clients with psychosis the dignity of risk, of seeking aliveness in ways that take up their wounds as essential. This deference to the wisdom of our client's process extends not just to realms where they push toward overstimulation or overwhelm, but more simply in the way they understand and narrate their sense of themselves and themselves in the world. How they translate their history, their experience, their relationship with their symptoms, how they take that up into who they make themselves to be, ought to warrant our encouragement, even when it resists forms that resemble our expected successful treatment outcomes. Many of these constructions are painfully negotiated in hard-won interventions, making something out of the ways the world has failed them. From a different angle, Searles points out an instrumental perspective of psychosis. Quote, because he perforce, not by choice, has been living on the sidelines of humanity, he is in a position to tell us some things which we have been too immersed in normal living to see, end quote. It is incumbent on us to face the ways that our expected and desirable treatment outcomes are shaped through and through by neoliberal, capitalist, and white logics, and that our egos and trainings are structured by these forces too. An examination of our regulatory anxieties and the force they exert in treatment is an ethical imperative. Our deep attachment to love and work as common goals, though perhaps admirable, too often fail to recognize persons living into new possibilities. The invitation before us is to reevaluate how attached our recovery paradigms are to ideals like gainful employment and productivity, financial independence, having a recognizable social network, what constitutes meaningful structure, ideas of achievement and self-sufficiency, endless pursuit of the good life as embedded in self-care driven by consumption. And not that these cannot be edifying and important for some, but they are prescriptions of a world not built to be inclusive. The contradictions in what I'm suggesting are apparent. After exploring the benefits of a context that offers community and meaningful work as pathways to wellness, I contest relationship and employment as treatment goals. But the world at large does not offer the valuation of an individual's contribution in the way a setting like the farm or Riggs or Ellenhorn does. It does not seek to maintain relationship amid radical difference the way the farm does. That's to say, work as such, or the maintenance of relationships predicated on assimilation, are not necessarily healing and not necessarily useful goals. We need to distinguish what is generative about these contexts and what does not have a correlate in the wider world. It seems to me that in using the stuff of their psychotic experiences to craft new selves, our clients potentiate possibility. And if we listen well to what our clients' symptoms say about the social, we can join in the process of world building. Foucault, Lang, Fanon, and plenty of others have written about the existence of madness as a diagnosis of our culture's deficiencies and ills. A couple examples, and a couple more recent examples. In the protest psychosis, Jonathan Metzl offers a sobering account of the ways racial difference and resistance to overt oppressive circumstances were inscribed into our diagnostic criteria for psychosis. Bleckner's writing about Harry Stack Sullivan's work with schizophrenic gay men shows the logics of psychotic solutions to chronic prejudice and the benefit of reprieve from it. These and other examples compel us to remember that the world we are preparing our clients for is the same one that has broken them. And so I remain suspicious of recovery as our guiding principle. I am suspicious of what we seek to recover, or rather what we hope to again disavow, of what producing normative subjects makes unseen, and how that in turn limits potential for freedom. Sarah Ahmed points out that to, quote, to recover can be to recover, to cover over the causes of pain and suffering, and that those who have been undone by suffering can be the agents of ethical transformation, end quote. My wager here has been that to take the experience of psychosis seriously and ethically includes an appreciation of its constructive and destructive drives, and that supporting its contributions to self-making, even if they are not focused on adapting to the existing social order, opens possibilities for our clients and for our world. To conclude, let us return to the text of A Little Life. He doesn't want you to admire him. He wants you to see him as he is. He wants you to tell him that his life, as inconceivable as it is still a life. Thank you.
I have a question that's connected to the previous discussion on loneliness and psychosis, the intersection there with LGBTQ, especially trans folks who have a particular kind of loneliness what work with. And I just wonder if you could expand a bit on your experience of that in your work.
It makes me think about the way that folks, particularly queer folks, make use of what the world sees as failure. Jack Halberstam's book, I think it's The Queer Art of Failure, looks at this in some really interesting ways. And actually, Sarah Ahmed's book that I quoted at the end, The Promise of Happiness, she looks at sort of typical happiness scripts and shows that the ways those are written sort of prescribe what happiness looks like and how to get there, and that for most subjects who are subjected to those, the ingredients of that are not available. She writes about like the feminist killjoy, the I think melancholy migrant, the unhappy queer. So I think there's a lot in sort of queer and trans studies now that's looking at sort of negative affect as being generative. So that's where my mind goes. So I think there's a lot of places for cross-pollination here.
I wrote down, I don't know if you really said this, I wrote down that you said voices and other symptoms are the self in disguise, and that your job is to allow patients to form their own feelings. Could you give a hypothetical example of what that would look like if someone says, I went to a restaurant the person was talking about? What would your response be in light of these two folks?
I'd certainly want to hear more from that person, and I'd want to think it in relation to sort of the development of our relationship and other things that I know about sort of the contours of their life.
So what might you say, just make it up, what would you say that would do that? Oh, right after the restaurant, this guy was talking about me over in the corner, it made me nervous. And then what would you say? Imagining that I'm telling you about myself in disguise and allowing me to form my own feelings.
I think I'd be first thinking about it and asking about it as if that other person was talking about them across the room. I don't think I'd jump right away. And I think that's some of the, what I'm trying to encourage us to do is how do we let go of our automatic knowing what's happening.
So what would you say? Would you ask them what they were saying about you?
Yeah, what were they saying? What was that like for you? You must be pretty important for people, strangers in a restaurant, to be talking about you. I don't think I'd say it flip like that, but. And if someone says, you know, that was really scary, I felt intimidated, I want to know more about those particulars, like what's scary like for you, what's intimidation like for you. I know what it's like for me, but I don't want to assume it's the same experience.
So much of what you said today resonated with me, and I feel like we have certainly plenty of time to process and kind of really form my thoughts. But one thing that really sat with me was that mention of external stakeholders as part of this process, and I think about the dual relationship, right? The families that are also the payers that also have these expectations of what treatment is going to look like or produce. And I'm curious if you can give some insight into how you navigated conversation with those external stakeholders when their expectations aren't necessarily the most important in the room. Their needs aren't being met.
Yeah, but they're also really important because they also provide a context in which the individual with symptoms can sort of grieve a change or expectation as well. I think, I'm not sure how to think about like specific things I would say, but what I'd be thinking about is inviting a process of grieving, and I was thinking a lot after Jeremy spoke that it's only when we grieve something are we able to think of something new or different or re-enlivened.
I really find the idea of traumatophilia particularly important. It just seems amazing to me, looking out at the world, how many people are afraid of anything that makes them uncomfortable, and they hurt them. And in a lot of ways, I think a lot of institutions are taking that on, trying to protect people, and that's just opening people up to another line of risk. Because we all need trauma as people. Like, that's what we're built for. We're built kind of be broken and then keep going. So I just think that idea that you have to embrace the damage to let it move on, or let it flow through, or do what it needs to do, just seems incredibly important. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in Laplanche's perspective that Saketopoulou draws on that I didn't have space to go into sees the origin of the subject in trauma, that it's as an infant, the one who doesn't speak, to be taking in messages from the social world and from caregivers that are utterly overwhelming and compromised by the adult's unconscious as well. So there's actually not a determinate meaning of the enigma. And so it's in trying to make sense of that, that we sort of, there's always like pieces of that are untranslated, embedded in us. So it's trauma that's at our formation and origin. See you at the round table.